The Galactic Empire had ruled unchallenged for centuries, its fleets sprawling across the void with an arrogance that had calcified into doctrine. Along its borders, patrols moved like clockwork, engines humming in precision, formations perfect to the last meter. No species had ever resisted for long, not once the banners of the Empire were raised in orbit. To defy such power was considered lunacy, and to most of the galaxy, it was impossible to imagine anything other than eventual submission. Yet whispers had begun to circulate through the undercurrents of rumor, whispers of ships that did not bear the sigil of any known vassal, vessels that crossed forbidden zones as if they were nothing more than open water. These rumors spoke of newcomers who ignored imperial warnings and traveled along routes thought impassable. At first, the reports were dismissed as border superstition, wild tales spun by smugglers and frightened traders. But then the patrols began to confirm them. The first encounter was not a dramatic battle but a flicker on long-range sensors. An Imperial cruiser detected angular silhouettes moving through restricted space. Their energy profiles were wrong, too erratic, too raw, and the metal signatures did not match any known design catalogued by the Empire's meticulous archivists. What unsettled the officers more than the unknown was the simplicity of the ship's appearance. No graceful curves, no elegant symmetry, only harsh lines, plating that looked stitched together, engines burning hotter than any regulated drive should. Primitive, they called them, but the unease in their voices betrayed that word's hollowness. Orders were dispatched swiftly. A squadron was sent to intercept, the admirals expecting the usual routine, a display of force, a broadcast of imperial authority, compliance from whatever backwater civilization had strayed too far. This was how it had always worked. Fear was universal, and fear was the cornerstone of imperial dominance. Yet as the squadron closed in, as the alien ships came into visual range, the usual script began to falter. The human vessels did not break formation, did not scatter in panic. Their approach was steady, deliberate, and every sensor sweep revealed more anomalies. Their hulls bore scars, blackened streaks of past battles, yet they carried themselves as though they were unafraid of wear or damage. Energy fields rippled faintly around them, not like the clean defensive shields the Empire perfected but like something raw and experimental, a weaponized chaos held in check. The first communication request was sent out, the Imperial insignia blazing across the transmission, the voice of command carrying the weight of centuries of dominion. The demand was simple: identify, surrender, and prepare to be escorted. The response was delayed, which in itself was unusual. And then the channel filled not with pleas or silence but with a sound that startled every officer in the command chambers. It was laughter. It wasn't nervous or hesitant. It was loud, sharp, confident, almost mocking. It was a sound so alien to the Empire's rituals of fear and submission that for a moment, the bridge officers froze, unsure if the translation software had malfunctioned. But the sound came again, unmistakable, human voices laughing openly at the Empire's demand. For the first time in memory, the great machinery of intimidation wavered. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, and even the seasoned admiral narrowed his eyes at the display, as though trying to decipher if the noise was some coded form of defiance. In the silence that followed, the Empire's certainty began to crack. No species had ever treated them this way. Some resisted with trembling speeches, others with desperate battles, but never with laughter. It was not the sound of ignorance but of something deeper, something forged in trials the Empire did not understand. Those angular, scarred ships suddenly seemed less primitive and more dangerous. What kind of people laughed in the face of overwhelming force? What history did they carry that made mockery their first answer to threats? The Admiral attempted another transmission, voice raised, threats sharpened with promises of annihilation. Yet behind the static came another ripple of laughter, not frantic but deliberate, as if the humans were testing the Empire's composure, enjoying the discomfort they sowed. For the first time in centuries, the vaunted aura of invincibility faltered, and in that fragile crack, a question arose that unsettled even the most loyal officer. Perhaps these newcomers had seen worse than anything the Empire could offer. That moment became the first fracture in the narrative of absolute control. On the edge of Empire space, The legend of humanity began, not with fire or fury, but with laughter echoing through channels meant to inspire obedience. It was a sound that turned intimidation into uncertainty, and uncertainty into fear. The officers didn't know it yet, but the galaxy had just shifted. The Admiral's words echoed with imperial certainty, promising destruction if compliance was not immediate. For countless civilizations, that voice had been the end of hope, the beginning of servitude. Yet the response that came was nothing like the desperate pleas he expected. A human voice, steady and unyielding, cut through the channel with deliberate clarity. "We don't kneel to tyrants." The words were followed by another wave of laughter, sharper this time, carrying a confidence that pressed against every ear listening. On the Imperial bridge, officers stiffened. No one had ever dared to answer so boldly. It was not the vocabulary of defiance that shook them. It was the ease with which it was spoken, as though the Empire were nothing more than an annoyance. For the humans, fear was not the natural reaction. Their culture had been shaped by centuries of conflict, by an endless succession of trials that left scars both on their world and in their memory. To them, threats from strangers across the stars were only another storm to endure. The laughter was not madness. It was defiance distilled, the sound of a species that had learned to survive by refusing despair. Where other species had seen imperial fleets as the embodiment of inevitable doom, humans saw only another adversary, and they met that vision with amusement. The Empire attempted its theater of power. Cannons flared harmlessly into the void, energy fields radiated in choreographed brilliance, engines roared in a show meant to dazzle and terrify. It was the same performance that had reduced other species to shivering silence, a ritual of dominance carefully crafted over centuries. But the humans did not cower. Instead, voices crackled through the calms again, mocking the spectacle. "Is this supposed to scare us? You wasted good energy for nothing." Another voice laughed, pointing out weaknesses in the formation, ridiculing the perfect symmetry that the Empire considered untouchable. The sound carried no desperation, no tremor, only the calm amusement of soldiers who had seen worse and lived. For the Imperial crews, this reaction was incomprehensible. Discipline began to falter as murmurs spread through the ranks. No training manual had prepared them for enemies who ridiculed their strength. It was one thing to resist in silence, another to break under fire, but to mock in the face of annihilation was something they had never encountered. The Admiral, determined to regain control, barked orders, reminding them that the Empire's will was law. But the foundation of fear upon which that law rested had already begun to erode. Humans had long histories of defying forces greater than themselves. Their wars had spanned continents, their disasters had reshaped nations, their survival had often been balanced on the thinnest edge. From that crucible had emerged a culture where laughter in the face of danger became a weapon of its own. It was a declaration that no threat could dominate the human spirit. To the Empire, steeped in rigid hierarchy and unquestioned obedience, this attitude seemed like insanity. Yet beneath the surface, officers felt the first stirrings of dread. If these newcomers could shrug off the Empire's most trusted methods of intimidation, what else might they resist? The Admiral pressed harder, speaking of extermination, promising fire that would erase every trace of the intruders. The humans only laughed louder, the sound filling the calms until even the most disciplined officers flinched. There was no panic in their tone, no denial, only a steady confidence that spoke of a truth the Empire could not yet grasp. These were not subjects waiting to be broken, they were predators who found amusement in the growl of another beast. In that moment, the entire balance shifted. The humans' defiance was not measured in weapons or numbers but in their refusal to treat the Empire with reverence. Every mocking word struck deeper than any missile could, undermining the foundation of fear upon which Imperial supremacy was built. The laughter, so simple and so human, became the sound of resistance, echoing across channels meant for submission. Officers who had once believed in the inevitability of Imperial dominance now questioned it in silence, haunted by the realization that these new arrivals did not fear death, nor power, nor the shadow of empire. They had faced their ultimatum, and their answer was laughter. The order to fire was given with the same confidence that had crushed dozens of civilizations before. Imperial cannons lit the void with precision volleys, energy lances carving through space in perfect symmetry. Yet what they struck did not yield as expected. The human ships twisted in patterns that made no tactical sense to the Imperial eye, veering from formation, darting between trajectories, allowing shots to graze but never cripple. The maneuvers were chaotic, sloppy by every standard the Empire valued, but they worked. Beams that should have crippled their vessels instead tore only into vacuum. What unnerved the Imperial officers most was that the humans seemed to be laughing even as the attacks rained down. Their calms remained open, filled with mocking commentary, voices daring the enemy to try harder, as if they were enjoying a game rather than fighting for survival. To Imperial doctrine, warfare was an art of discipline, rigid formations and rehearsed sequences, each move predictable and perfected through centuries of conquest. The humans shredded that doctrine in minutes. Their movements were not symmetrical, not planned according to any algorithm the Empire could decipher. Instead, they fought like predators in a storm, improvising, adapting, twisting unpredictably. Where the Empire sought to control chaos, the humans thrived in it. Every reckless turn, every sudden dive into enemy fire, every unexpected strike spoke of a species that had long ago accepted war not as a disruption but as a natural state. The Empire fired again, volleys coordinated with flawless precision, only to watch the humans slip through the gaps as though they had expected the sequence before it began. Imperial captains began shouting over one another, confusion spreading through their ranks. "They're not following any doctrine," one officer muttered, disbelief in his voice. Another whispered words that chilled those around him. "It's madness, and it's working." Hull plating that should have shattered under the barrage instead absorbed impacts with unnerving resilience. Human vessels showed damage, but they pressed forward relentlessly, maneuvering with a boldness that defied calculation. Sparks trailed from wounded engines, plating hung loose in ragged sheets, yet still they advanced, and through the open calms came bursts of laughter, as if the damage were nothing but a badge of honor. To the Empire, whose fleets had always been symbols of pristine perfection, the sight of battered ships refusing to yield was horrifying. For the first time in living memory, the Imperial forces faced opponents who did not seek to minimize loss at any cost, but who accepted it, even embraced it, as part of the struggle. Their tactics were not built on preservation of assets, but on exploiting opportunity, no matter the risk. To the disciplined minds of Imperial command, this approach was unthinkable, yet it carved holes in their formations faster than any polished doctrine. The psychological toll was immediate. Soldiers accustomed to striking terror into their foes now found themselves unsettled. Their enemy laughed when they should have cried, taunted when they should have begged. The sound carried through every channel, mocking the very essence of Imperial power. For officers who had known only submission from those they faced, the realization that fear had no purchase on these intruders was destabilizing. As the clash continued, the human ships delivered counterstrikes not with overwhelming firepower but with precision born of instinct. A sudden burst from what looked like a damaged cannon disabled a shield generator. A reckless dive that should have been suicidal instead ended with an Imperial frigate spinning crippled into silence. Each victory was punctuated not by silence but by another ripple of laughter, as though humanity were proving not only its strength but its joy in defiance. By the time the skirmish reached its peak, the Empire had lost more than ships. They had lost the certainty that had carried them through centuries of dominance. To face an enemy that laughed at destruction, that turned chaos into strategy, that thrived under pressure where others broke, this was something new, and it was terrifying. The rigid order of the Empire met the fluid, unpredictable will of humanity, and for the first time, it was the Empire that faltered. Reports traveled faster than ships, carried on encrypted channels directly to the heart of the Empire. In the Grand Council chambers, the first transmissions of the encounter were replayed in disbelief. Admirals, senators, and overseers leaned forward as the sound of human laughter filled the hall. No translation error could explain it, the meaning was unmistakable. A species faced with overwhelming force had mocked the threat instead of trembling. The image struck deeper than any casualty report, for it signaled a flaw in the very foundation of imperial authority. Fear had always been the unshakable pillar of control. If fear could be dismissed with amusement, then the Empire's strongest weapon was no longer absolute. The Council erupted in argument. Some dismissed the incident as an anomaly, insisting that the squadron had mismanaged their engagement. Others demanded immediate mobilization of larger fleets, convinced that overwhelming firepower would erase this insolent species before their defiance spread. Yet in the corners of the chamber, quieter voices carried more weight. Scholars of alien psychology, long tasked with predicting reactions to imperial rule, admitted they had no framework for what had transpired. To laugh at annihilation was not cowardice nor bravado, it was something alien even to the Empire. That uncertainty alone was dangerous. Whispers spread beyond the Council's sealed walls. News of the laughing invaders reached allied species, vassals long held in chains of intimidation. Stories circulated that perhaps the Empire could be challenged, that perhaps submission was not inevitable. In the mess halls of conquered soldiers, tales grew exaggerated: humans who joked as their ships burned, warriors who mocked death itself. For populations who had endured centuries of silent obedience, such rumors were sparks in dry fields. The Empire tried to suppress them, but the very attempt to smother the story gave it more power. Imperial strategists analyzed the battle recordings, searching for logic in human behavior. They found none. Tactics shifted with no discernible pattern, responses came too quickly to be rehearsed, and damage that should have crippled vessels was endured without hesitation. What stood out most was the psychology. Humans did not treat the engagement as survival against superior force but as a challenge to overcome, almost as entertainment. That mindset unsettled the analysts more than any weapon signature. An enemy that feared nothing could not be controlled. An enemy that turned fear into mockery could unravel empires. In the corridors of power, debates turned to panic. Some demanded preemptive strikes, others warned that escalating would only cement the legend. The council split into factions, each shouting over the other while the memory of laughter played in the background. No decision carried consensus, and in that paralysis the myth of humanity grew unchecked. For every moment the Empire hesitated, the perception of weakness spread wider. Meanwhile, the humans continued forward, indifferent to the Empire's turmoil. They had not broadcast declarations of conquest, nor pledges of alliance. They had only responded to threats with laughter, and in doing so they had shifted the balance of perception across the galaxy. Alien civilizations under Imperial rule began to whisper the same question: if these humans could mock the strongest fleet in existence, what else might they do? The Empire had always believed itself eternal, its discipline unbreakable, its aura of control beyond question. But now doubt gnawed at its foundations. Officers who had once spoken with certainty now hesitated. The sound of laughter echoed in their thoughts long after the transmissions ended, a reminder that the old patterns no longer applied. It was not a battle loss that shook them most, but a truth they could not silence. They had encountered a species that did not measure strength by fear, and in their amusement lay a defiance more dangerous than any weapon. A final transmission was sent across the contested border, not from Imperial channels but from the humans themselves. The voice carried no fear, no hesitation, only a clarity that cut through static like a blade. We came to explore, not to kneel. You mistake fear for strength. We laugh because death does not frighten us, and power does not command us. The message was short, but its weight echoed across every listening ear. For the first time, the Empire had been addressed not as a master but as a pretender. It was not the words alone that unsettled the listeners, but the tone behind them, calm, confident, dismissive. That message spread farther than any imperial decree. Across vassal systems, intercepted recordings were whispered and replayed. Subjugated populations who had lived for generations under the shadow of imperial fleets began to imagine the unthinkable. If one species could answer fire with laughter, then perhaps the Empire was not invulnerable. The idea took root quickly, not because of weapons displayed or victories claimed, but because of the psychology revealed. Here was proof that fear was not universal, that courage could be louder than cannons. Within the Empire itself, the effects deepened. Officers who had stood watch on the edges of the battle reported sleepless nights, haunted by the echoes of that mocking sound. It was not terror of annihilation but a deeper unease, the realization that their greatest weapon had been rendered useless. For centuries, intimidation had been their most reliable tool. Now they had encountered beings who stripped it of power with nothing more than a laugh. The implication was staggering. If humanity could not be controlled by fear, then they could not be controlled at all. Spies and envoys sent to learn more about the humans returned with reports that unsettled the council further. They described people who carried humor as armor, who treated hardship not as tragedy but as challenge. Soldiers who toasted each other after battles, engineers who joked while repairing vessels under fire, civilians who found ways to laugh even when resources were scarce. To outsiders it seemed madness, but to humanity it was resilience. Laughter was not denial. It was a declaration that despair would never own them. That revelation spread like a contagion, leaving alien analysts unable to frame it within any known doctrine. In council chambers, debates raged without resolution. Should the humans be crushed immediately with overwhelming fleets? Should they be studied, contained, perhaps even appeased? No answer satisfied, because none could erase the sound that had shattered centuries of dominance. Every time the recordings were replayed, the laughter rang out with unshaken strength, and with it came the recognition that this species was not like any other the Empire had conquered. They were not merely resistant, they were untouchable in spirit. Among the conquered races, the legend grew into something larger than fact. Tales painted humans as warriors who welcomed fire, explorers who laughed at storms, strangers who mocked even death itself. Each retelling exaggerated details, but the heart of the story remained. The Empire had been challenged, and the challengers had not trembled. That story became a seed of rebellion, a promise that empires could fall. For humanity, the encounter was not remembered as a grand battle or decisive victory. It was remembered as a statement. By laughing at threats meant to enslave them, they declared to the galaxy that intimidation would never bind them. Their laughter became more than defiance. It became a symbol of a spirit unbroken by fear, a sound that unsettled the powerful and inspired the powerless. From that day forward, whenever Imperial fleets gathered in intimidation, whispers would rise among their foes. Listen for the laughter, for if humans are present, fear no longer belongs to the Empire.